Um, if God is all powerful, he could just stop your pain right now.
Right.
And if
But
he's all good, well, he would want to. So why are you currently staring at this pile of jagged, ugly puzzle pieces in your life that just make absolutely no sense? Today, we are taking a deep dive right into the illogical problem of evil.
It's really the heaviest question we can ask. Because usually, when you sit down to put together a jigsaw puzzle, you have the box cover.
Yeah, you have the picture?
Exactly. You have a visible goal. Even when you pick up a weird, dark little piece, you know exactly how it contributes to that beautiful final picture. You have context for the chaos.
Right. But when you step into the reality of human suffering, it's like somebody has snatched that box cover away. You're just left holding these isolated, dark pieces. And honestly, right now in my own life, I am holding a handful of them. I'm going through a season of deep emotional struggle, season of suffering, really. And I brought this stack of deeply personal essays by Alan S.L. Wong to the table today because I am finding it incredibly hard to reconcile these raw, painful emotions with the theological truths that I know in my head.
Well, I really appreciate you sharing that. It takes profound courage to admit when you are in that space. And as we unpack Wong's writing today, I want to step into this conversation not just as an analyst, but really leaning into the role of a biblical counselor for you and, well, for anyone tuning in who is feeling that exact same disconnect.
Thank you. I really need that today.
Of course, because the foundational empathy in Wong's essays begins with this really crucial acknowledgement. He states quite clearly that no answer to questions of the mind can ever satisfy the cry and anguish of the heart.
Man, that line, it just stopped me in my tracks. Because before we can even begin putting these puzzle pieces together or, finding our way out of the pit, we have to address that massive question of the mind, the one I opened with. If God is so good, why does this hurt so much?
Yeah, the classic atheist argument.
Right. You see it everywhere. Since pain and evil clearly exist in the world, are all-powerful, all-good God must not exist. And in my darker moments, I have to admit that logic can feel like a really heavy weight pressing down on me.
It's an argument that has troubled humanity for centuries, really. But Wong builds a fascinating counter-argument here. He claims that an atheist is actually disqualified from using the problem of evil as an argument against God.
Wait, disqualified? That sounds like a massive logical leap. How does he justify telling an atheist they can't even use the word evil in a debate?
Well, it comes down to understanding what a purely naturalistic worldview actually entails. If there's no God, then life is just the result of random, undirected processes. Biology, survival of the fittest. So in that worldview, imagine a dictator who is starving his people while living in absolute luxury. Technically, you cannot call that dictator evil.
Because, according to pure biology, he's just the apex predator.
Exactly. You can only call it the strong dominating the weak. It is natural selection playing out on a geopolitical scale. To call his actions evil, rather than just, unfortunate for the weak, you must assume that there is an objective, universal standard of good that this dictator is violating.
Oh, wow. Okay, so by even using the word evil, you're admitting there's this invisible standard hovering over humanity that we are all supposed to follow.
That is the mechanism behind the argument, yeah. Acknowledging true, objective evil demands a moral law. And a moral law logically presupposes a moral lawgiver, an anger completely outside of human evolutionary preference.
That makes a lot of sense.
Right. So therefore, acknowledging that objective evil exists doesn't disprove God at all. It actually proves God's existence. Without a lawgiver, there are only personal preferences and biological impulses. There is no objective evil.
Okay, so if we follow Wong's logic and establish that God exists, we still have to figure out what evil actually is and where it came from. And Wong uses this brilliant donut hole analogy that I really want to explain because it shifts the entire paradigm.
Oh, it's a great analogy. Go for it.
He argues that evil isn't a created entity. God didn't sit in his workshop and invent pain or malice. Evil doesn't exist on its own.
It's a lack of something.
Right. Evil is simply the absence or corruption of something good. Just like a donut hole isn't a physical thing itself, it's literally just the absence of dough in the middle of a pastry. Or how darkness isn't a substance, it's just the absence of light.
That's a really helpful way to frame it.
Yeah. According to this framework, God created a good world and gave humans free will. But it was humanity's rebellion going all the way back to Genesis 3 that brought corruption, decay, and the absence of good into the world.
Right. God didn't create a painful world. He created a good world that we fractured. And that distinction matters because it tells us about God's original intent.
But see, here is where abstract theology completely breaks down for me. Understanding the donut hole, logically, knowing that my pain is just a corruption of God's good creation, that doesn't stop the adrenaline of panic when things go wrong in my life.
Well, it doesn't.
It doesn't make the tears stop. And Wong brings up the Psalmist, specifically in chapter 6 and 13, and I just relate to this so deeply right now. The Psalmist is literally crying until his couch is dissolved with tears, screaming out, "How long, O Lord, will you forget me forever?"
And that tension between the head and the heart is exactly why Wong doesn't leave us in the philosophical realm. Knowing what evil is doesn't instantly heal the pain. So we have to shift our focus to why God allows it to touch our lives personally. Like, why are we specifically in the pit?
Yeah, so if we look at the biblical text through Wong's eyes, how does he diagnose the pit? Why are we suffering?
Well, what's vital here is that Wong avoids any sort of one-size-fits-all platitude. He unpacks several distinct biblical precedents for suffering, and they are radically different from one another.
Okay, like what?
For instance, sometimes suffering is simply the direct result of human cruelty and our corrupted nature. Look at Cain murdering Abel out of pure, unchecked jealousy. Abel didn't do anything to provoke God, right? He suffered because Cain chose to sin.
So sometimes we are just collateral damage to other people's free will.
Precisely. But then there's a second category. Sometimes suffering is God's direct judgment on sin. The flood in Noah's day is the classic example of that.
The Wong points out a detail there that completely changes the tone of that story for me. God didn't just snap his fingers and flood the earth in a fit of rage. He gave a 120-year warning.
A century of patience. I mean, generations of people watching a man build a giant boat on dry land, hearing the warnings and actively ignoring them. The same thing happened centuries later with the divided kingdoms of Israel and Judah.
Right, they faced exile.
Brutal exile, but only after hundreds of years of ignoring the prophets. That kind of suffering is a disciplined response to sustained rebellion.
Okay, so we have human cruelty and we have divine judgment. But the third category he explores is the one I find the most difficult to swallow when I'm hurting. The idea that suffering is a required mechanism for maturity, like a means to a greater good.
It's really difficult pill to swallow, but consider the psychology of Joseph's story in the book of Genesis. Joseph was sold into slavery at 17 years old by his own jealous brothers. He was ripped from his father. Then he actually does the right thing and resists his master's wife. And what is his reward?
He gets thrown in prison.
Falsely accused of assault and thrown into a foreign dungeon.
And Wong points out that it took 23 years of intense suffering, betrayal, and waiting before Joseph became the viceroy of Egypt. 23 years. Imagine being 17 and your life just stops. That is an enormous pile of ugly puzzle pieces to hold on to before you finally get to see the picture.
It is staggering, but look at what those 23 years accomplished. They took a proud, naive, somewhat arrogant teenager who flaunted his special coat and forged him into a patient, wise, forgiving leader capable of running an empire. Yeah. When he finally reunites with his brothers, he realizes God sent him ahead to save thousands of lives from a massive famine. The pit was the crucible for his character.
And then there's the fourth category Wong highlights, which is Satan's temptation, the book of Job. I mean, Job loses his family, his wealth, and his health literally overnight. He is left sitting in a pile of ashes, scraping painful, weeping sores all over his body with broken pieces of pottery.
Total devastation with zero explanation.
And this is where I have to push back hard. Because what if I feel like I haven't done anything to deserve my current pit? What if you're looking at your life and thinking, I'm not Cain. I haven't ignored 120 years of warnings like Noah's generation. Why am I sitting in the ashes? Why is this happening to me?
That is the raw cry of the heart. And Wong addresses the sense of entitlement by bringing in a completely radical perspective shift from Jesus himself in Luke chapter 13.
Oh, this is the story where people come to Jesus demanding an explanation for a tragedy, right?
Exactly. The Roman governor, Pilate, had brutally murdered a group of Galileans while they were worshiping. And in a separate incident, a tower in Siloam collapsed and crushed 18 people to death.
Just totally random suffering.
Right. And the crowd comes to Jesus basically asking, what dark secret sins did these victims commit to deserve such awful, sudden suffering?
Because they operated on the assumption that bad things only happen to bad people. Karma, essentially.
Right. But Jesus flips the entire human script. He looks at the crowd and says, no, those victims were no worse sinners than anyone else in Jerusalem. He reframes the entire human condition by stating that we are all guilty. We all possess that fractured, corrupted nature we talked about earlier. According to Jesus, the real question we should be asking isn't, why did this terrible thing happen to them? The real question is, why aren't more of us facing God's judgment right now?
Wow. I mean, when you're hurting, that feels like a punch to the gut.
It strips away our illusion of innocence. It forces us to realize that every breath we take outside of judgment is pure grace. Furthermore, look at how God finally answered the innocent Job. After chapters and chapters of Job demanding an audience, God shows up in a whirlwind.
But he doesn't give Job the puzzle box cover.
Yeah.
He doesn't explain the cosmic wager with Satan. He gives 0 reasons.
He gives 0 reasons. Instead, God asks Job a barrage of impossible questions. Where were you when I laid the earth's foundations? Do you know when the mountain goats give birth?
Just putting him in his place.
Essentially, yes. God overwhelms Job with the sheer magnitude of his sovereignty. He reminds Job, and reminds anyone listening right now who is stuck in the pit, that God's ways are inscrutably higher than ours. As the prophet Isaiah writes, his thoughts are not our thoughts.
Okay, but this is exactly where abstract theology breaks down when the adrenaline of panic hits. It's one thing to nod your head and say God's ways are higher when you're sitting in a comfortable armchair. It is another thing entirely when your life is falling apart. When Wong's own life fell apart in June 1994, he didn't lean on the donut hole theory, he punched a cupboard.
That story of his is remarkably vulnerable. Let's look at the mechanics of what happened there.
Yeah, so he had just left full-time Christian ministry. He had a wife, 2 kids, and maybe a year's worth of savings. He's suddenly thrust into this terrifying secular job market where absolutely nobody values his years of ministry skills.
A total identity crisis on top of financial fear.
Exactly. He felt completely cornered, the panic set in, and he admits that he literally punched a cupboard in his house out of pure frantic frustration. He even notes with this dry, dark humor that he specifically chose the cupboard because punching a concrete wall would have hurt too much.
It's a calculated breakdown, yeah.
I read that and thought, I know that exact feeling. That blind, suffocating panic where you forget everything you know to be true. Wong compares his emotional state to the disciples in Mark chapter 8, and it is such a perfect parallel. The disciples are in a boat miles from shore, and they suddenly realize they forgot to bring bread. They start panicking, terrified they are going to starve.
Completely ignoring who is sitting in the boat with them.
Yes, Jesus is sitting right there, completely exasperated. He basically asks them, do you have hardened hearts? Did you completely forget that just a few days ago I miraculously fed 5,000 people and then another 4,000 people with just a few scraps of food?
They had amnesia to God's faithfulness.
Exactly. And in my own suffering, I am those disciples. I look at my empty bank account or my broken relationship or my diagnosis, and I panic. I completely forget the miracles God has done in my past.
And Wong uses that story to remind us that trust is a step-by-step learned process. It is not an instant emotional fix. He points to Zacharias and Elizabeth in Luke chapter 1 to illustrate the psychology of waiting.
They were the parents of John the Baptist,
right? And the text goes out of its way to tell us that Zacharias and Elizabeth were righteous, obedient servants of God. They walked blamelessly. They were doing everything right. Yet they harbored this deep, painful wound of infertility. When the angel Gabriel finally appears and tells Zacharias they will have a child in their old age, Zacharias demands proof.
Even though he's talking to a literal angel.
Exactly. He had trusted God with his eternity, but he couldn't trust God in this one specific, deeply bruised area of his life. Because of his unbelief, he is struck dumb. He cannot speak for 9 months. He only learns to truly surrender and trust through that long, forced period of silent waiting, culminating in him finally writing the name John on a tablet. Trust is forged in the silent waiting.
So while we are in the waiting, while you're sitting in the pit next to the cupboard you just punched, Wong distills 3 highly actionable takeaways for survival.
Yeah.
Like, how do we climb out, or at least keep breathing while we're down there?
Well, the first step he outlines is rigorous self-examination. Using Lamentations 3, we need to honestly assess if our own sin put us in the pit. Did we slide into this mess through our own pride or bad choices?
That's a hard question to ask yourself.
It is. But if the answer is yes, the action step isn't to wallow in guilt. It is to immediately confess it and claim the promise in Isaiah 1:18 that though your sins are like scarlet, they will be made as white as snow.
That's beautiful. The second takeaway is about what to do with that frantic, cupboard-punching energy. Wong realized that if he just sat there stewing in his panic and unemployment, he was going to become toxic and bitter. So he channeled the energy.
Right.
He took all that adrenaline and poured it into something positive. He started writing a book on dramatized family devotions, something he had just been doing privately with his kids.
He chose creation over destruction.
Yes. And the wild part is, working on that book helped him develop the exact editorial and creative skills that unexpectedly landed him his next job.
That is a profound strategy for handling anxiety. And his third step is perhaps the most vital for our emotional health. Bring your raw doubts directly to God. Do not suffer in silence.
Yeah, she can handle it.
Exactly. Wong leans heavily on Hebrews 4, which reminds us that we do not have a high priest who is removed from or cannot sympathize with our weaknesses. Jesus wept. Jesus felt betrayed. Jesus felt abandoned on the cross. You can bring your anger, your tears, and your ugly puzzle pieces right to the throne of grace, and you will find mercy, not condemnation.
This is where Wong's framework gets truly disruptive for me, because as you take these steps, examining yourself, channeling your energy, yelling your doubts at a sympathetic God, your very definition of what you were hoping for begins to radically change. What you consider a blessing gets turned completely upside down.
Yeah, we start viewing God as a cosmic vending machine whose only job is to dispense physical comfort.
Right? And Wong shares this startling story from August 2017 to drive this home. He was living in an apartment in Singapore, a public housing HDB flat, and he caught fire.
Oh, wow.
Yeah. One of the bedrooms was entirely gutted by the flames. The rest of the house was completely trashed, covered in thick black soot and water damage from the fire hoses. The upheaval was massive. He even mentions that a neighbor hung a mirror on their own door just to deflect the negative energy radiating from his burned-out apartment.
A completely devastating disruption of his life.
And yet, looking back on it, Wong asks this jarring question in his essay. He asks, was the fire a blessing? I mean, how on earth can watching your home burn be considered a blessing from God?
Well, it requires separating practical, earthly blessings from true, eternal, spiritual blessings. Now, Wong is honest. The practical blessings of the aftermath were nice.
Like the insurance payouts.
Right, the fire insurance paid for a newly restored apartment. He and his wife got to bond over shopping for more functional furniture. But he argues that the true blessing, the kind of spiritual blessing talked about in Ephesians 1, happened internally.
What did the fire actually reveal inside of him, though?
The massive, overwhelming stress of being displaced and dealing with the disaster exposed a hidden, ugly blind spot in his character. Under the intense pressure of the fire's aftermath, he found himself becoming highly irritable. He was speaking sharp, unkind words to his wife and his mother. The fire acted as a refining tool. It burned away his comfortable, polite exterior to reveal the jagged flaws underneath.
Wow. It forced him to confront the darkness he was harboring.
Exactly. It gave him the opportunity to recognize that irritability, repent of it, and allow God to chip it away. The fire was a blessing because the stress of it ultimately made him more holy, more patient, and more like Christ.
That completely flips the script on how we view the terrible things that happened to us. During that season of rebuilding, Wong actually changed his email signature. I want to read it because it serves as an incredible anchor for anyone's soul when they are in the pit. It simply read, "Grateful to God that I am not what I can be, thankful that I am what I could not be, hopeful of what I will be."
That is the perfect synthesis of a life surrendered to God's refining fire. It acknowledges our deep flaws, it celebrates the grace that holds us together, and it looks forward to the ultimate redemption of our character.
So as we look at all these puzzle pieces Wong has laid out, the absolute requirement of a moral lawgiver, the historical reasons for suffering, the messy reality of learning to trust, and the painful refining of our character, what is the ultimate takeaway for someone listening who is sitting in the ashes today?
The ultimate takeaway is anchored in the character of God himself. We must cling to Lamentations 3.33, which assures us that God does not afflict willingly or grieve the children of men. He doesn't take sadistic pleasure in your pain.
Yeah.
Yet, he holds absolute terrifying sovereignty over both the good and the ill. And according to this theological framework, the ultimate, undeniable proof of his love for you isn't an explanation of your specific pain. The proof is the eventual total cessation of evil itself.
Because God didn't just watch us suffer from a distance, he stepped into the pit with us.
Exactly. As the prophet Isaiah writes in chapter 53, Jesus took our pain. He bore our suffering. He was pierced for our transgressions. The cross is God's final, violent answer to the problem of evil. He absorbed the worst of human cruelty and divine judgment so that he could promise us a future, the future detailed in Revelation 21, where evil is permanently destroyed, where God himself wipes away every tear in a new heaven and a new earth.
You know, thinking about that future, thinking about Jesus taking our pain on the cross, it leaves me with one final thought. Something Wong doesn't explicitly mention, but it builds perfectly on his essays. Something for you to mull over in your own season of suffering as you stare at the broken pieces of your life.
What is that?
If Jesus' crucifixion and resurrection are the ultimate solution to the pain and suffering in this world, and if God promises to eventually wipe away every tear, to make all things completely new and perfect, why did the resurrected Jesus choose to keep his scars? When he appeared to his disciples after conquering death, he still had the jagged holes in his hands and his side. In a perfect, glorified, resurrected body, he deliberately chose to keep the wounds. Perhaps when God eventually restores your life, he won't just erase the wounds of your suffering as if they never happened. Instead, he might transform them. Maybe those ugly, dark, jagged puzzle pieces you are holding right now aren't meant to be thrown away or forgotten. Maybe when the box cover is finally revealed, those dark pieces will become permanent, glorious evidence of the grace that carried you out of the pit.